Hello, Elias Kanaris. Elias and I go back a while, 4 or 5 years, but there's also another familiar connection through my father as well. So it's a real pleasure to meet you today and to understand your journey, your leadership journey in particular. So welcome.
Guy, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's my pleasure to be here. And yes, our lineage goes back for me nearly 30 years when I first met your dad. And great to be on this podcast. And let's have a great conversation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Elias, we've had a quick chat before. I've explained that this is about your personal journey. It's about how you got to be where you are. And I know, we've spoken previously. I know that you've got some quite unique experiences in your background. But do you want to start at the beginning? Do you want to start, way back, possibly childhood? Where did it all start for you? Where did your career leadership journey start?
Well, let me go back and share a great quote that I heard John Maxwell say. He was asked the question, are leaders born? And his answer was quite simple: no, they're not. Babies are born. So I was just another baby that was born, in my case, to parents who were Greek in heritage, born in North Africa in a little country called Libya, but we don't talk about that often. But having said that, when I grew up, in my case, I grew up in an environment where every day I heard my dad call me an idiot. He said basically I was stupid. And what I didn't realize at the time, growing up in that environment, is that my dad was the sort of person who called everybody an idiot. So I thought that I was special. And so I behaved as if I was an idiot. So when it comes to leadership, I'd say I probably wasn't set up to become the leader that I am today. And I had the challenges of a mindset that's literally allowed me to stay at the bottom of my class as I went through high school in the UK, all the way through to university, where I was just scraping through. And I found that in my life and my career, I'd make mistakes, but I always was willing to, I guess, look at my personal development. And if I think about something that happened to me, it was probably at the late 90s, having immigrated from the UK, where I'd lived for 25 years, to New Zealand. And I got introduced to the network marketing business, the Amway business. And during that time, there was a lot of personal development that went through. And I started to look at myself from a personal development. How could I improve myself as a salesperson, myself as a leader, myself as a family man, as a father, as a husband? And that really was the starting point. But I can probably go back further in time and say, irrespective of how I was brought up and what my self-limiting beliefs were, I was always surrounded by people who were better than me, and I aspired to reach their levels. And so even though I was the youngest sibling, I had older people around me. And that was, I think, quite a pivotal influence in how I viewed leadership and grew into the leader I am today.
Wow. So what were the factors that made that transition from Libya to the UK, then the UK to New Zealand?
So when I went, I was born in the early 60s, and when Colonel Gaddafi came to power in Libya, it would have been in 1970. Being a non-Libyan, being a Greek by heritage and birth, we were given the option to leave the country. Well, I say option, it was really forced upon us. And my dad's job, he was in the banking industry, took him to London, where he was part of British Bank Middle East, a subsidiary of Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. And he was quite senior in that leadership structure. So I was probably 8 years old when I left Libya and was brought up in the UK. So I left a country, came to a new culture in terms of the UK, where my accent, even my name, Elias, was not one that was common in that environment.
No.
Having to learn how to fit in early on, get to a new school, make new friends, work my way through. And I lasted 25 years in the UK. So really my education was in the UK. My career started there. My family also started in the UK. And in 1995, I had the opportunity to emigrate and ended up coming to New Zealand. And guess what? I did it again. I knew nobody that I'd met before I came here, and yet I came with my family having to start afresh. No job in hand, no real network of people, but have to trust myself that I can actually go there and reestablish the connections and the networks here, which has been a blessing over the last 30 years.
How did you cope? What tactics, what skills, did you cope in resetting your life, building those contacts?
I think the first thing I did was I needed to understand how to blend in. So I think it's really important that we figure out, you don't want to literally stick out from the crowd. You want to be part of the crowd. So I had to learn early on my best Dick Van Dyke accent, hello, Governor, how are you? So I could just be a local in London. But then what I found is that one of the giftings and skills that I've got is that of relationships. And I've really gotten to understand that if you are good at building relationships, they can help you. And one of the best techniques that I found in doing this was the ability to ask good questions. Because quite often I'd be meeting people who are very senior or who had better worldly experience than myself. And to stop myself from looking like a real muppet, I would actually have to ask good questions. So if I asked a question, number one, it would give them a chance to speak, which then gave me a chance to think. So I could then analyze what they were saying. So I learned early on that part of this relationship building was nodding your head and saying, that's interesting. And then going back and repeating what they said in a way that made me sound high intelligent. Again, you have to understand, I was brought up thinking that I was the dunce in the corner of the room. So I think, Guy, if I was to say one of the things, it was that relationship building that helped me once I blended in.
And it's a tactic I advise clients all the time is, people like talking about themselves. So not quite in the same extreme way, but get people asking them about themselves, asking their opinion is a way of building those links, those relationships. So amazing that was so successful for you as well. Thank you. So you came to New Zealand. Anything in the UK, career highlights or?
Wow, career highlights in the UK. I think I stumbled my way through my career in the UK. I remember having roles that would last between 18 months and maybe 3 years. And back then, which would have been, I guess, mid 80s through to the mid 90s, you might turn around and say that was unusual that people would have that. I think today it's more common for us to see people in the gig economy, especially younger people, millennials, who will change jobs every couple of years. I think if I had a highlight, it had to be the work that I did on a product called the Personal Communication Computer, the PCC for short, which back then in the early 90s, was a desktop computer. It had some dedicated hardware, some software, a video camera that was connected to it. You had a device at one end, a device at the other end, and literally you used to have these video calls between yourself and your colleague. And then you have a whiteboard that you annotated it on. And the PCC, as it was known back then, was quite revolutionary. Today, it evolved in what we now know as Skype. So the product, I guess, was quite revolutionary. And what I had the privilege of getting involved with was the launch of this product to the point that we were referenced in the Financial Times, in the Daily Telegraph, the Independent, all the big tabloids that we had back in the day. And to me, looking back now, I can say, wow, what a great opportunity! What a way to create a career where you are being interviewed by the press alongside the Prince of Kent. So, one of the wealthiest monarchs or members of the royal family back at that time in the UK. And when you've got these, you almost take it for granted. But if it was a highlight here, I guess that was one of the highlights, being able to be in that position and being listened to and taken literally verbatim at times by the press.
And no longer the dunce.
No, yeah, well, in my mind, probably still the dunce, but hey, sometimes you need the external view, Guy, of somebody else looking at this and telling you and pointing out what you have done as your success to help you overcome those self-limiting beliefs.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, that's quite impressive. And I was in Hewlett-Packard at the time, and we were using that similar type of technology back in 1990 to talk to the US. And I also remember how revolutionary that was, to actually spend time on video directly communicating with people thousands of miles away. So, wow. So 95, came to New Zealand, up sticks with family. Is there a particular reason, or was that a family decision that played out?
Well, for me, it was quite a simple decision. I had quite a young family at the time. My two eldest daughters at that stage were aged 5 and 2. And around about the same time that we emigrated, maybe a year or two before, we had a horrendous situation in Liverpool where a young lad called James Bulger was abducted by two 10-year-olds. Those of us who were around can remember this so vividly. And unfortunately, he was abducted, he was tortured and eventually killed. And I thought to myself, do I really want to bring my family up in that environment? And I had options to go and live in the USA. A lot of my family is based on the East Coast. I had the opportunity to go to Australia. My ex-wife was born in Sydney, and obviously we had the opportunity to go that pathway. Somebody suggested Italy. I was working with Olivetti at the time, and so we were considering, do we go there and join the headquarters? And one day somebody suggested New Zealand. And to be honest, I had never been to New Zealand. I knew lots of Kiwis living in London, and I can remember coming back and channel surfing, watching Clive James on TV. And Clive happened to have an episode where he says, today we've got TV from New Zealand. So I thought, oh, I better sit up straight, did my tie up properly. And they had an episode of Crime Watch, which they shared. And it was probably the maybe 2 or 3 minutes as the introduction, the WPC talk about, the crime. They say, we'd like your help solving the following crime. Somebody had their shopping stolen out of the car in Remuera. I thought, that's the crime, that's the country for me. And that's why I ended up in New Zealand.
Oh, well, I'm not going to say anything to that, but I totally understand where you're coming from. A different world entirely. Wow. Okay. So you got to New Zealand. Did you have a job? Were you starting completely afresh?
Again, starting afresh, all I managed to do was make some connections with some of the recruitment agencies who are in the UK recruiting for New Zealand organizations. The industry that they seemed to have a lot of interest in was telecommunications and information technology. So I fitted both molds in terms of the video conferencing we're doing with the PCC. And one of the connections I made in New Zealand, I'd done some research, found some agencies, send my CV forward prior to going out there. But within a week of landing here in New Zealand, I had probably 3 or 4 interviews lined up. And the interview that got me the first role was down in Wellington, where I was interviewed by Teresa Gatting, who at the time was head of marketing for Telecom New Zealand. Soon afterwards, she became the CEO there. And she interviewed me a week in and started talking about something called call centers. And she identified that as a solution that if we put together a solution program together, we could probably help ourselves retain up to about $25 million of at-risk business. And it was through just one connection. One person I met in the UK was from New Zealand. Outside of that, nothing was set in stone. No job was available. It was a leap of faith, to be honest, Guy, coming over here. But I knew that I knew this was the right place for me. And honestly, one of the best decisions I ever made was coming to New Zealand, maybe fortuitously getting that first job, but I haven't looked back since then.
Wonderful, wonderful. So 95, working in New Zealand. We're approaching the early noughties, but where did those sort of first 5 or 6 years take you in terms of your career and your leadership career, particularly?
Well, for me, the first thing was the networking side of things. So through that first job, it was getting to know people, getting to develop relationships. In fact, that's where I ended up meeting my current wife and my forever wife. So Kay and I met through work. And when I realized that there's somebody with immense depth of knowledge, I soon figured out that if I didn't know it, I better marry it. So that was the easiest decision I had to make. But having done that, interestingly enough, for me, my real leadership journey sparked off when I met your dad. And through your dad, through the Amway business, he introduced me to 3 cassette tapes. I'm showing my age now, Guy, and dating this particular story. But I was the general manager by this stage in a car leasing company. So I thought that I was involved in leadership because I had the title and the position. But when I listened to the 3 tapes were incredibly influential. The very first tape was Zig Ziglar. And Zig Ziglar at the time was talking about sales. I never heard anybody talk about sales and make it humorous and engaging. So that to me took my first bit of interest. The second one happened to be John Maxwell, who talked about leadership. And again, I hadn't thought about leadership in terms of self-leadership, leading yourself first to then grow yourself so you can lead others. And then the third cassette tape that I listened to was all about forgiveness by a guy called Skip Ross. And I have to say that that particular cassette undid me in terms of my lack of self-worth and my ability to blame my father for my circumstances. So if it wasn't for those 3 tapes that Clive gave me at the beginning, it would not have made it dramatically changed my trajectory from a leadership perspective and started to get me thinking about self-leadership. How do I lead myself? It's like the old adage when we are on an airplane, they're doing the safety briefing. What do they say for you to do when the oxygen mask comes down? Put it on yourself first before you help others. And that's been such an important element of my leadership growth, is that ability to understand if I can lead myself well, then I can lead others better.
Wow. Amazing. And we're leading up to it because I know what's coming next, but there was a significant event in the early noughties that, again, I feel I know transformed your life and sent you off in yet another direction. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, it happened to be an ordinary Tuesday that particular morning. I was in Wimbledon, South London, in my parents' house, and actually ended up having a wardrobe malfunction. I woke up that morning and found out that I'd lost my tie. Well, you might turn around and say, that's not really a wardrobe malfunction, Elias. But at the time, I was flying business class. I needed to dress up for the part. So literally, I remember kissing my mother goodbye, hugging my dad as the taxi driver packed my bags into the back of the taxi and drove me to London Heathrow. And my first port of call as I arrived at London Heathrow was to go to the tie rack so I can buy myself a new tie. The day just so happened to be September 11, 2001, and that day dramatically changed the trajectory of my life, because literally I found myself halfway through the flight getting some notification from the captain, who said that due to a significant incident in the USA, Federal Aviation Authority had shut down all airspace, and we'd been asked to divert, and we were ending up in Newfoundland in Canada. And that was how we were introduced to the what we now know as 9/11 and the incidents that day. And that became one of 5 days that I was stuck in Newfoundland, which taught me a lot about leadership in many different aspects.
And what were some of those lessons?
Well, the very first thing that we found out was the way that Captain Mike Ballard, who was the pilot on UA 929, introduced us to the topic of the issue. And I think if I think about this, Captain Mike really took us through a 3-step process. The first thing he said is, number 1, you're not in trouble. Number 2, we believe in you. And number 3, we're here to help. His messaging became that sort of aspect of leadership that we started to understand. If we can help other people understand that they're not in trouble, as a leader, you are reducing the opportunity for panic to set in. I heard of other airplanes where their pilot said there's a difficulty or an issue with the airplane, we have to divert. Can you imagine what goes through people's minds? Because for me, that first message said to me, well, one of 2 things. The very first thought was maybe somebody had assassinated the president in the USA. And that was followed by a second, possibly more sinister thought that maybe somebody had dropped an atomic bomb on US soil. But once we'd landed, Captain Ballard was able to pipe in the BBC World Service and explain what had happened as much as he knew at the time. You have to understand, 2001, Guy, there was no in-flight Wi-Fi, there was no social media, no smartphones. So all we could do was rely on the BBC World Service to be our source of truth at the time.
Wow. So you landed Newfoundland, 5 days. What other leadership lessons did you learn and that you've taken forward?
So from that, we spent the first 24 hours in the airplane as the locals set up, number 1, a immigration service, number 2, a security service to take effectively nearly 6,500 passengers off 38 airplanes and process them. And then we ended up spending the last 4 days with the Salvation Army. And it's the Salvation Army that I started to learn some of the other leadership lessons. The very first lesson is look after yourself first, which we've talked about already in this call. It's so important to look after ourselves first, and especially now, if we think about the post 9/11 experience, even recently, as recently as the pandemic, it's okay to ask for help. You've got to be able to understand that there's no stigma attached to the fact that, you know, you might not be doing well, but there's resources around to help us. So the first lesson is look after yourself first. The second lesson is to expand your network, look after others. Who else can we go and look after? And I saw this demonstrated so well at the Salvation Army, where we were a guest for 4 days, where Sister Teresa, as we got to call her, was looking after the needs of the other people and identifying those who were at risk, to the point that she allowed a family to use her own office, her personal cell phone, to call family back in Australia to emergency evacuate their son from Bali, who'd had a medical incident. So we understood that it's important to expand your network, look after others. I've seen that demonstrated so many times since, especially during COVID, when we were sitting here. A good friend of mine, Bill used to call me and probably about 20 or 30 other people at least once a week, just to check in, make sure we're all okay. It's ironic because Bill supports Manchester United, I support Arsenal. We have nothing in common, but he would be there. And that was so important for me to learn that as a leader, we've got to look out for others and help them through. And if there's a third thing that I learned, it's, take time to stop and smell the roses. We have to change the rules. At the end of the day, whatever we're doing pre-COVID had to change. Even things like the airline industry completely changed how we'd go and do our security check-ins, what we're allowed to take on, not allowed to take on an airplane, etc. So you've got to learn as a leader that when an incident happens or something changes, everything changes, and you've got to throw away the rule book and sometimes come back and redesign it to meet your new norm.
Powerful messages, very, very powerful. And so post your 9/11 experience, what impact did that have in your immediate role? What impact has that had in your career since?
Well, post 9/11, I have to say that there was a lot of turmoil in my own thinking. And I don't think that I'm any different from a lot of other people who went through that experience, either physically, people in New York, or other passengers like myself who were traveling at the time. For me, it took a lot of self-development. I had gone through a career change, having been a general manager. I was then made redundant from that role back at the end of the 1990s, and then had to reestablish my career and redevelop it. So by that stage, post 9/11, I was still in the upward trajectory, product development manager in an outsourced provider in the contact center industry. But I soon found myself getting more and more leadership roles. Post 9/11, I started to work within the professional speaking industry. And that's got me involved into a leadership role where I became what I call the accidental president for the Professional Speaking Association here in New Zealand. And it was not my number one choice in doing this. In fact, I remember going to the AGM and being told, by the way, the president wants to nominate you to become the next president for the Auckland chapter. So he said, avoid eye contact. So I tried everything I could, cross-eyed, looking sideways. Didn't work. She made eye contact with me, and I was ready to say no to being the president. What I wasn't ready to say no to was, she said, okay, how about working as the vice president and working for a year under this other chap as president, learning that way. I didn't have an answer for that, so I became the vice president. And 6 weeks later, due to personal circumstances, the president resigned and I got promoted. And that got me into another level of international leadership, where I got involved as a New Zealand representative for the speaking industry. And that's when I had to play a bigger game. That's when I started networking with some of the best speakers in the world and realizing that for us to succeed and for Elias not to be a real fool, I had to go back to what I knew, make those connections, ask those good questions, start to learn from people who have done it for sometimes decades before me, and build my way up. But leadership is leadership irrespective of the organization. It's just the nuances and doing it with an international team versus doing it with a local homegrown team. But it was a great experience nonetheless, and one that I thoroughly enjoyed.
Wonderful. And since then, where has your journey taken you? Because you're still a young man.
Oh, I wish that you're so kind, Guy. I'm getting into my wisdom years. I like to think of them where I'm trying to use the experience of what I've accomplished over the last 30 or 40 years in the industry. For me, the journey has continued to grow. I'm really looking at how do I then apply all the learnings over the last 3 or 4 decades, including the learnings I had on an international basis with the Global Speakers Federation and Professional Speaking Association in New Zealand. I've worked as the CEO for a number of organizations over that period of time. I've also understood that governance is an important element of any organizational leadership structure. And here in New Zealand, I've been working through the Institute of Directors Chartered Membership program, and that becomes quite important to understand how do we apply governance within a business into any organization. So I've been really looking at that from two aspects. Number one, how do I, as a fractional CEO, come in and help an organization shift from acting as probably as a club into a professional body? And number two, how do I use this experience over the last 3 or 4 decades to help other leaders lead? And really the aspect of building trust and helping them to understand how they operate has become a bigger focus for me. Mentoring those sort of leaders, helping them to grow, helping them to find a pathway, and then handing over the baton so they can then release themselves from some of the day-to-day activities into a group that they can then have trust with, to then hand that baton over themselves. So that's been my journey over the last probably decade or so, which I've really enjoyed.
Well, it has been an enormous joy to speak to you today. Is there anything else? Any last thoughts? Anything you'd want to say to yourself of 30 years ago that you think listeners would value?
Well, if I had the chance to go back 30 years and say, Elias, do this, the one thing I'd say is do it now and do it without fear. I wish I'd really had taken the leap in leadership a lot earlier, but definitely I would not be who I am today if I hadn't gone through all those mistakes over the last 30, 40 years.
Wonderful. That in itself is a powerful message. We sometimes try to forget those mistakes, but we tend to learn more from our mistakes than from our successes, and we should embrace that as a positive thing rather than try to forget it. So thank you. It has been a joy spending time with you, Elias, and I wish you all the very, very best for the future. Your experiences, your wisdom has been hugely enlightening. So I really appreciate the time that we spent together.
Thank you for having me as a guest, Guy.